In the unforgiving desert of Arizona, where the sun burns mercilessly and death lurks behind every rock, two enemies found themselves bound by something stronger than hatred, the sacred duty to preserve life. This is not a tale of war or revenge, but of an Apache warrior who defied everything his people believed to save the life of a white soldier who had come to destroy his world. When Private Thomas McKenna felt the Apache arrow pierce his chest near Skeleton Canyon in 1885, he thought his 22 years of life were over. Blood poured from his wound like water from a broken dam, and his vision blurred as he collapsed onto the burning sand. But fate had other plans. An Apache warrior named Nailnish, whose own brother had died from a soldier's bullet just days before, made a choice that would echo through generations. What happened next defied every law of war, every rule of survival, and every boundary between civilization and the wild. It was a moment when humanity transcended hatred, when an ancient healing wisdom met modern warfare, and when two men from different worlds discovered that life itself was worth more than any victory. This is their story, raw, authentic, and absolutely true. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of Skeleton Canyon as Private Thomas McKenna wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. At 22 years old, he had joined the United States Army with dreams of adventure and honor, but 3 months on the frontier had taught him that war was nothing like the stories his grandfather told about fighting in the Civil War. The Apache campaigns were different, brutal, unpredictable, and deadly. McKenna adjusted his heavy pack and squinted through the heat waves rising from the desert floor. His unit, the 4th Cavalry Regiment, had been tracking a small band of Apache warriors for 5 days now, following their trail through some of the most unforgiving landscape in America. The year was 1885, and tensions between the Apache people and the expanding United States had reached a breaking point. Geronimo and his followers had broken free from their reservation, and the army was determined to bring them back, dead or alive. The young soldier from Pennsylvania had never imagined he would find himself in such a place. Back home in Pittsburgh, where his father worked in the steel mills, the desert seemed like something from a fairy tale. But, here, surrounded by towering rock formations and endless stretches of sand and scrub brush, McKenna felt like he had stepped into another world entirely. The heat was unbearable, water was scarce, and danger lurked behind every boulder and cactus. Captain Morrison, a weathered veteran of Indian wars, had warned the men that morning that they were close to their quarry. "These Apache know this land better than we know our own backyards," he had said, his voice grim. "They can disappear into thin air and reappear behind you before you know what hit you. Stay alert, stay together, and trust your instincts." McKenna's instincts were screaming at him now as he climbed a narrow path between two massive rocks. Something felt wrong. The desert was too quiet. Even the buzzards that usually circled overhead had disappeared. His fellow soldiers were spread out in a line, following the faint trail left by unshod ponies, but McKenna couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. His hands were slippery with sweat as he gripped his Springfield rifle. The weapon felt heavier than usual, and his mouth was dry despite the water he had sipped from his canteen just minutes before. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy, every sound made him jump. This was his first real engagement with hostile Indians, and he was terrified. Behind him, Private Johnson whispered a joke to lighten the mood, but McKenna couldn't focus on the words. His attention was fixed on the ridge line ahead, where something had caught his eye. A flash of movement, quick as lightning, but unmistakably human. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but before the words could leave his lips, the world exploded into chaos. The Apache attack came from 3 directions at once. Warriors materialized from behind rocks and bushes as if they had been part of the landscape itself. Their war cries echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that chilled McKenna to the bone. These were not the savage enemies described in army propaganda, but skilled fighters defending their homeland with deadly precision. McKenna dove behind a boulder as bullets and arrows began flying. The crack of rifles mixed with the whistle of arrows and the shouts of soldiers calling for ammunition. Dust kicked up around him, and he could taste the grit on his tongue. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. From his position, he could see several Apache warriors moving with incredible speed and agility across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. They were not the stereotypical painted savages he had expected, but lean, muscular men with intelligent eyes and strategic minds. Their leader, a warrior with streaks of gray in his black hair, directed the attack with hand signals that showed years of military experience. That warrior was Nailnish, though McKenna would not learn his name until much later. At 43 years old, Nailnish had been fighting to protect his people's way of life for over 2 decades. He had seen his lands taken, his children forced into government schools, and his people confined to reservations where they slowly starved. Just 4 days earlier, his younger brother Naeli had been shot and killed by soldiers during a raid on their hidden camp. The loss had torn a hole in Nailnish's heart that felt like it would never heal. But Nailnish was not just a warrior seeking revenge. He was also a medicine man, trained in the ancient healing arts of his people. His grandmother had taught him that all life was sacred, even the life of an enemy. It was a belief that would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. McKenna raised his rifle and fired at a warrior running between 2 rocks. The shot went wide, echoing uselessly off the canyon walls. Before he could reload, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the whistle of an arrow coming straight at him. Time seemed to slow as he watched the arrow arc through the air. It was perfectly crafted, with turkey feathers for guidance and a razor-sharp obsidian point that gleamed in the sunlight. McKenna tried to throw himself to the side, but he was not fast enough. The arrow struck him in the upper right side of his chest with tremendous force, punching through his blue wool uniform and burying itself deep in his flesh. The impact spun him around and knocked him to the ground. Pain exploded through his body like liquid fire, and he could feel warm blood beginning to soak his shirt. The arrow had missed his heart by inches, but it had punctured his lung, and he could feel air bubbling out of the wound with each breath. McKenna lay on his back, staring up at the brilliant blue sky, and realized he was dying. Blood was flowing freely from his chest, and his breathing was becoming more labored by the second. Around him, the battle continued to rage, but it seemed distant now, like something happening to someone else. His thoughts turned to his family back in Pittsburgh. His mother would be devastated when she received the telegram. His father would blame himself for not stopping his son from joining the army. His sister Mary, only 16 and full of dreams about her future, would cry for weeks. They would never know what really happened here in this remote canyon. To them, he would simply be another casualty of the Indian Wars, another name on a long list of soldiers who died far from home. But McKenna was not ready to die. He was too young, had too much he still wanted to do with his life. He wanted to return home and marry Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter who had promised to wait for him. He wanted to see the steel mills of Pittsburgh one more time, to walk the familiar streets of his neighborhood, to taste his mother's apple pie again. With tremendous effort, he managed to turn his head and look around. The battle was beginning to wind down. Most of his fellow soldiers had taken cover behind rocks, and the Apache warriors seemed to be withdrawing to higher ground. Perhaps they had accomplished their goal of driving the soldiers away from their hidden camp. Perhaps they had decided that the cost of continued fighting was too high. McKenna tried to call for help, but only a whisper came out. Blood was filling his lungs, making it harder and harder to breathe. He could feel his strength ebbing away like water flowing through his fingers. Soon, he would lose consciousness, and then, it would all be over. That was when he saw the Apache warrior approaching him. Nailnish had been preparing to withdraw with the rest of his band when he noticed the young soldier lying alone behind the boulder. Something about the sight stopped him in his tracks. Perhaps it was the way the soldier's hand moved weakly toward his chest, or perhaps it was the expression of fear and pain on his face. Whatever it was, Nailnish found himself walking toward his enemy instead of away. The other warriors called out warnings, but Nailnish raised his hand to signal that he would handle this alone. They trusted his judgment and melted back into the rocks, keeping watch but giving him space to do whatever he felt he needed to do. McKenna saw the Apache warrior coming and tried to reach for his rifle, but his arms would not obey him. All he could do was lie there and wait for the killing blow that would end his suffering. He had heard stories about what Indians did to captured soldiers, and he prayed that death would come quickly. But when Nailnish knelt beside him, the warrior's eyes held something McKenna had not expected: compassion. The Apache man was older than McKenna had first thought, with weathered skin and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of hardship and loss. His long black hair was streaked with silver, and he wore traditional Apache clothing made from deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. Nailnish looked at the arrow protruding from McKenna's chest and knew immediately that the young soldier would die without immediate help. The arrow had been shot with great force and had penetrated deeply. Blood was flowing steadily from the wound, and the soldier's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow and labored. For a moment, Nailnish hesitated. This was his enemy, one of the soldiers who had come to destroy his people's way of life. Just days ago, soldiers like this one had killed his brother. Every instinct told him to finish what the arrow had started and walk away. But something deeper, something that came from his training as a medicine man, would not let him leave. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, "All life is sacred, grandson. The spirits do not care about the color of a man's skin or the language he speaks. They care only about the beating of his heart and the breath in his lungs." McKenna watched in amazement as the Apache warrior began to examine his wound with gentle, skilled hands. The man's touch was surprisingly tender, nothing like what McKenna had expected from a savage warrior. Nailnish's eyes were focused and intelligent as he assessed the damage, and McKenna could see that this was a man who knew about healing as well as fighting. Nailnish spoke to McKenna in Apache, his voice low and reassuring despite the fact that the soldier could not understand the words. He was explaining what he was going to do, telling McKenna to stay calm and fight to stay conscious. Then, switching to the broken English he had learned from traders and army scouts, he said the words that would change both their lives forever: push harder. You push harder, or you die. With those words, Nailnish placed both hands on McKenna's chest, one on each side of the arrow, and began to apply pressure to slow the bleeding. The pain was excruciating, and McKenna screamed, but he could feel the flow of blood beginning to lessen. The Apache warrior was not trying to kill him, he was trying to save his life. "You understand?" Nailnish said, his English rough but clear. "You must fight. You must push harder than pain. Push harder than fear. Push harder than death." McKenna nodded weakly, not fully understanding what was being asked of him but sensing that this man was his only hope for survival. He summoned every ounce of strength he had left and tried to focus on staying conscious, on continuing to breathe, on fighting the darkness that threatened to overwhelm him. Nailnish worked quickly but carefully. He knew that removing the arrow immediately could cause more damage than leaving it in place, so instead he focused on stabilizing McKenna's condition and stopping the worst of the bleeding. He tore strips of cloth from McKenna's own shirt and packed them around the wound, creating pressure to slow the flow of blood. As he worked, other Apache warriors began to return, curious about what their medicine man was doing with the enemy soldier. Some of them argued that he should let the soldier die and that helping him was a betrayal of their dead brothers and sisters. But Nailnish continued his work, speaking firmly to his companions in their own language. "This is not about revenge," he told them. "This is about who we choose to be. Our enemies call us savages, but we know better. We are the people who understand that all life is sacred. If we abandon that understanding, then we truly become what they say we are." Young Chatto, a warrior who had lost his father to army bullets, stepped forward angrily. "This soldier would not help you if you were dying, Nailnish. His people have shown us no mercy. Why should we show them any?" Nailnish looked up from his work, his hands still pressing against McKenna's chest. "Because mercy is not something we give to those who deserve it, nephew. Mercy is something we give because we choose to be better than our anger." The words silenced the opposition, though McKenna could not understand them. All he knew was that this Apache warrior was fighting to keep him alive, and, for reasons he could not begin to comprehend, he was putting tremendous effort into the task. But, even with Nailnish's skilled help, McKenna was losing the battle. His vision was growing darker, and his breathing was becoming more and more labored. He could feel his life slipping away despite the warrior's best efforts. That was when Nailnish made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could not save McKenna here in the canyon, but he might be able to save him back at the hidden Apache camp where he had access to his full collection of healing herbs and medicine bundles. It would mean taking an enemy into the heart of their sanctuary, putting his own people at risk for the sake of a soldier who had come to destroy them. But, as he looked into McKenna's fading eyes, Nailnish knew what he had to do. The decision to take McKenna to the Apache camp was one that would test every bond of loyalty and trust that Nailnish had built over his 43 years of life. As he looked down at the dying soldier, he could see his own reflection in the young man's frightened eyes, two human beings caught in a war that neither of them had started, but both were paying the price for. "We take him," Nailnish announced to his warriors, his voice carrying the authority of both a war leader and a medicine man. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Chato stepped forward, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You cannot be serious, uncle. This man is our enemy. His people have murdered our children, stolen our land, and driven us into these mountains like hunted animals. Now you want to bring him into our most sacred place?" Other warriors gathered around, their voices rising in heated discussion. Some supported Chato's position, arguing that showing mercy to enemies was a luxury they could not afford. Others remained silent, torn between their respect for Nailnish and their desire for revenge against all white soldiers. Nailnish listened to their arguments without interrupting, his hands never leaving McKenna's chest where he continued to apply pressure to the wound. He understood their anger because he shared it. The pain of losing his brother Nayeli was still fresh, a wound in his heart that bled with every heartbeat. But he also understood something that his younger warriors had not yet learned, that hatred was a fire that consumed the one who carried it more than the one it was meant to burn. "I do not ask you to understand," Nailnish finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I ask you to trust. This soldier will die if we leave him here. But if we save him, if we show him that Apache people are capable of mercy even toward our enemies, perhaps we plant a seed that will grow into something better than this endless war." McKenna drifted in and out of consciousness as the debate continued around him. Sometimes he could hear voices speaking in a language he did not understand, occasionally catching fragments of broken English. Sometimes he felt hands moving him, lifting him, carrying him. But mostly he was lost in a gray fog of pain and confusion, fighting to hold on to life with every shallow breath. When the decision was finally made to move him, McKenna was barely aware of what was happening. Strong hands lifted him onto a travois, a simple stretcher made from two long poles and a blanket that could be pulled by a horse. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his chest, and he cried out despite his efforts to remain silent. Nailnish walked alongside the travois as they began the difficult journey to the hidden camp. He monitored McKenna's breathing, adjusting the pressure on the wound and speaking words of encouragement that the soldier could not understand but somehow found comforting. The Apache warrior had removed his own shirt and torn it into strips to create additional bandages, and his weathered hands were stained with blood from his efforts to keep the young soldier alive. The path to the Apache camp was treacherous even for healthy warriors. It wound through narrow canyons and up steep rocky slopes that offered protection from army patrols but made travel slow and dangerous. For a man with a punctured lung and a severe arrow wound, the journey was almost certainly fatal. But Nailnish refused to give up. Every time McKenna's breathing became too shallow, every time his pulse grew too weak, the Apache medicine man would stop the procession and perform emergency treatment. He had lost too many people to this war already, his brother, his nephew, countless friends and relatives. He was not willing to lose another life, even if that life belonged to an enemy. Young Chato rode ahead as a scout, his movements quick and silent as he checked for signs of pursuing soldiers. Despite his disagreement with Nailnish's decision, he would not abandon his war leader in the wilderness. The bonds of Apache loyalty ran deeper than personal opinion, and Chato understood that protecting the group meant protecting everyone in it, even unwelcome additions. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the desert heat gave way to cooler air that was easier to breathe. Pine trees appeared among the rocks, and the sound of a distant stream promised fresh water. McKenna's fevered mind registered these changes dimly, as if they were happening to someone else. Sometimes he thought he was back home in Pennsylvania, riding through the mountains with his father on a hunting trip. Sometimes he thought he was dreaming. But the pain in his chest was real enough to anchor him to reality. With each movement of the travois, with each jolt over rough ground, the arrow shifted slightly in his wound, sending fresh spikes of agony through his body. Blood continued to seep from around the shaft, despite Nailnish's best efforts to control the bleeding. 3 hours into the journey, McKenna stopped breathing. Nailnish noticed it immediately and called for the procession to halt. He knelt beside the travois and placed his ear against McKenna's chest, listening for any sign of life. The soldier's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his lips were turning blue from lack of oxygen. Without hesitation, Nailnish began performing a technique his grandmother had taught him many years ago, a way to force air back into lungs that had stopped working on their own. He tilted McKenna's head back, pinched his nose closed, and breathed his own air into the soldier's lungs while pressing rhythmically on his chest to restart his heart. The other warriors watched in amazement as their medicine man fought death itself to save the life of their enemy. Some of them had never seen this particular healing technique, and they gathered around in silent fascination as Nailnish worked with desperate intensity. For several minutes, nothing happened. McKenna remained lifeless, his body growing colder with each passing moment. Chatto began to speak, suggesting that they should accept the soldier's death and continue to their camp, but Nailnish silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Push harder." Nailnish shouted, not to McKenna but to himself, to the spirits, to life itself. "Push harder." He continued his efforts, breathing for McKenna, pumping his chest, refusing to accept that death had won. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and his own breathing became labored from the effort. Then, suddenly, McKenna gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it was enough. His chest began to rise and fall on its own again, and color slowly returned to his lips. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused, but alive. The warriors around Nailnish murmured in amazement. They had witnessed their medicine man bring a dead man back to life. Even Chatto, who had opposed the rescue mission from the beginning, looked shaken by what he had seen. "The spirits have spoken," Nailnish said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "This man is not meant to die today." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency. McKenna drifted in and out of consciousness, but his breathing remained steady and his pulse grew stronger as they climbed higher into the mountains. The crisis had passed, but Nailnish knew that the young soldier was far from saved. He would need extensive treatment with herbs and traditional medicines that were waiting at their hidden camp. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, they finally reached their destination. The Apache camp was hidden in a natural bowl surrounded by high cliffs, accessible only through a narrow passage that could be easily defended. A small stream ran through the center of the camp, providing fresh water, and there were caves in the cliff walls that offered shelter from storms and enemies alike. The arrival of the wounded soldier caused an immediate sensation among the Apache families who called this remote place home. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, curious about the pale stranger who had been brought into their sanctuary. Women gathered around the travois, some offering help and others expressing concern about the wisdom of harboring an enemy. Nailnish's wife, Desba, hurried forward as soon as she saw the procession arrive. At 38 years old, she was a skilled healer in her own right and had assisted her husband with many medical emergencies over the years. But she had never been asked to help save the life of a white soldier. "What have you done?" she asked her husband, her voice filled with concern rather than anger. She trusted Nailnish's judgment completely, but she could see the potential consequences of his decision written on the faces of their fellow Apache. "What the spirits commanded," Nailnish replied simply. "This man was dying, and I could not let death take him without a fight." Desba looked down at McKenna, who was unconscious again but breathing steadily. She could see the arrow protruding from his chest and the blood-stained bandages that her husband had applied. She could also see something else. The young soldier was probably not much older than her own son would have been if he had lived past childhood. "Bring him to the healing lodge," she said without further question. "I will prepare the medicines." The healing lodge was a large teepee set apart from the main camp, decorated with sacred symbols and filled with the tools of traditional Apache medicine. Bundles of herbs hung from the wooden frame, and painted gourds filled with various powders and tinctures lined the walls. It was here that Nailnish had learned the healing arts from his grandmother, and where he had saved countless lives over the years. As they carefully moved McKenna into the lodge, placing him on a bed of soft furs and blankets, Nailnish began to gather the materials he would need for the most challenging medical procedure of his career. Removing the arrow would be extremely dangerous. One wrong move could cause massive internal bleeding or damage to vital organs. But leaving it in place would eventually lead to infection and death. Desba lit a fire in the center of the lodge and began heating water in clay pots. She selected specific herbs from the bundles hanging around the walls, plants that would help control bleeding, prevent infection, and manage pain. Some of these medicines had been used by Apache healers for hundreds of years, passed down through generations of wisdom and experience. McKenna stirred as the warmth of the fire began to penetrate his chilled body. His eyes opened slowly, and he found himself staring up at a ceiling made of buffalo hide and wooden poles. Strange symbols were painted on the walls around him, and the air was filled with the scent of burning sage and other unfamiliar herbs. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. This place was unlike anything he had ever seen, part hospital, part church, part ancient sanctuary. Then, he tried to move and felt the arrow still embedded in his chest, and reality came flooding back. He was in an Apache camp, surrounded by people who had every reason to want him dead, but who were apparently trying to save his life. Nailnish appeared in his field of vision, and McKenna instinctively tried to pull away. But the medicine man's touch was gentle and reassuring as he checked the soldier's pulse and examined his wound. "You are safe," Nailnish said in his broken English. "We help you. You understand? We help you live." McKenna nodded weakly, not sure he believed what he was hearing but too weak to resist even if he wanted to. He watched in fascination as Desba moved around the lodge, preparing medicines with practiced efficiency. She was a beautiful woman, with long black hair braided with silver ornaments and traditional Apache dress that was both practical and elegant. Other Apache people began to gather outside the lodge, drawn by curiosity and concern. Some of them had never seen a white man up close, and they whispered among themselves about this strange turn of events. Children pressed their faces against the lodge opening, their eyes wide with wonder, until their mothers pulled them away. But not everyone in the camp was pleased with Nailnish's decision. A council of elders had gathered around the central fire, and their voices could be heard through the thin walls of the healing lodge. They were debating whether allowing an enemy soldier to remain in their camp put everyone at risk. Old Mongas, the camp's senior war chief, was particularly vocal in his opposition. "This is madness, Nailnish," he declared, his voice carrying across the camp. "What if this soldier survives and returns to his people? What if he tells them about our location, our numbers, our defenses? You may have saved one life, but you could be condemning all of us." These concerns were not unreasonable. The Apache had survived in these mountains by maintaining absolute secrecy about their hiding places. Discovery by the army usually meant death or capture for everyone in the camp. By bringing an enemy soldier into their sanctuary, Nailnish had created a problem that could have consequences far beyond McKenna's individual fate. But Nailnish was not deterred by the criticism. As he prepared for the delicate surgery of removing the arrow, he spoke quietly to his patient, explaining what was about to happen even though he knew McKenna could not understand most of his words. "This will hurt very much," he said, mixing Apache and English phrases. "But you must not move. You must be strong like warrior. You must push harder than pain." McKenna gripped the edges of the fur blanket beneath him and nodded his understanding. He had been a soldier long enough to know that sometimes survival required enduring unbearable pain. If this Apache medicine man could save his life, he would try to be worthy of the effort. As Nailnish began to work, carefully cutting away the cloth around the arrow and cleaning the wound with boiled water and antiseptic herbs, McKenna found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been working in his father's shop in Pittsburgh, dreaming of adventure and glory. Now he was lying in an enemy camp, his life in the hands of people he had been taught to fear and hate. But there was nothing fearsome about the way Nailnish worked. His movements were precise and confident, his touch gentle despite the strength in his weathered hands. This was a man who had dedicated his life to healing, who saw something sacred in the act of preserving life even when that life belonged to an enemy. The surgery was about to begin, and both men, the Apache medicine man and the white soldier, were about to discover just how much courage they both possessed. The surgery began at midnight, under the light of a full moon that filtered through the smoke hole at the top of the healing lodge. Nailnish had waited for darkness not out of any mystical belief, but because the cooler night air would help prevent infection and make the delicate procedure easier for everyone involved. McKenna lay on his back, fully conscious but groggy from the pain-relieving herbs that Desba had given him. The medicine was unlike anything he had experienced, not the harsh whiskey or laudanum used by army doctors, but a subtle combination of plants that dulled his agony while keeping his mind clear. He could feel everything that was happening, but the sensation seemed distant and manageable. Nailnish had spent hours preparing for this moment. He had gathered his finest surgical tools, knives made from obsidian that were sharper than any steel blade, thin bone needles for stitching, and strips of sinew that would hold the wound closed. He had also prepared a collection of medicines that would be applied throughout the procedure, antiseptic washes made from pine bark, clotting powders derived from certain mushrooms, and healing salves that would promote rapid recovery. But the most important preparation had been spiritual. Nailnish had spent the evening in prayer, asking his ancestors and the spirits of the mountain for guidance. This surgery was beyond anything he had attempted before, and he knew that skill alone might not be enough. He would need divine assistance to save McKenna's life. Desba sat beside the fire, tending the flames and keeping the surgical tools sterilized in boiling water. She had assisted her husband with many healing ceremonies over the years, but she had never seen him this focused or this nervous. The weight of what he was attempting pressed down on everyone in the lodge. "Are you ready?" Nailnish asked McKenna, switching to English to make sure his patient understood the gravity of the moment. McKenna nodded, gripping a leather strap between his teeth to keep from crying out. He had seen army surgeons work, and he knew that what was about to happen would test every limit of his endurance. But he also knew that refusing the surgery meant certain death. The arrow had to come out, no matter how much it hurt. Nailnish began by carefully examining the arrow shaft, determining its angle and depth. The obsidian point had penetrated between two ribs and lodged near the lung, missing the heart by less than 2 inches. It was a killing shot that had been reduced to a survivable wound only by the angle of impact and, perhaps by divine intervention. "I must cut around the arrow," Nailnish explained, speaking as much to calm his own nerves as to inform his patient. "Then, I pull it out very slowly, very carefully. If it breaks, if pieces stay inside, you die. If I pull too fast, you bleed too much, you die. So we go slow, we go careful." McKenna closed his eyes and tried to think of home as Nailnish made the first incision. The obsidian blade was so sharp that he barely felt it, but when the medicine man began to widen the wound to expose the arrow point, the pain became overwhelming. Despite the herbs, despite his determination to be brave, McKenna screamed. The sound echoed through the camp, causing people to look up from their evening activities and wonder what was happening in the healing lodge. Children who had been playing around the fire stopped their games and moved closer to their parents. Warriors who had been standing guard at the camp's perimeters turned toward the lodge with expressions of concern and curiosity. Nailnish paused in his work, giving McKenna time to recover from the initial shock. He wiped sweat from his patient's forehead and spoke softly in Apache, words of encouragement and strength that McKenna could not understand but found strangely comforting. "The worst is coming now," Nailnish said, returning to English. "When I pull arrow, you will want to die. But you must not die. You must push harder than the pain. You understand?" McKenna nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had been a soldier for only a few months, but he had learned that surviving combat was as much about mental toughness as physical strength. He had to find something inside himself that was stronger than the agony in his chest. Nailnish gripped the arrow shaft with both hands, feeling for the exact angle that would allow him to withdraw it without causing additional damage. The obsidian point was barbed, designed to inflict maximum damage and make removal difficult. One wrong move could tear through vital blood vessels or puncture organs that had so far been spared. With infinite care, he began to pull. McKenna's back arched off the bed as pain unlike anything he had ever imagined tore through his body. He bit down on the leather strap so hard that his teeth cut grooves in the material. His hands clenched into fists, and his whole body trembled with the effort of remaining still. The arrow moved slowly, millimeter by millimeter, as Nailnish maintained steady pressure while monitoring McKenna's breathing and pulse. Blood began to flow more freely from the wound as the arrow shaft was withdrawn, and Desba immediately began applying pressure with clean cloths to control the bleeding. Halfway out, the arrow caught on something, bone or cartilage, and refused to move further. Nailnish paused, studying the situation carefully. Forcing the arrow could cause it to break, leaving pieces inside McKenna's body that would be impossible to remove. But leaving it in place was not an option either. "I must cut more," Nailnish announced, reaching for his smallest obsidian blade. "The arrow is stuck. I must free it." McKenna nodded weakly, no longer able to speak through the pain. He could feel his strength ebbing with each drop of blood that flowed from his wound, but he forced himself to remain conscious and still. His life depended on Nailnish's skill, and any movement could disrupt the delicate surgery. The additional cutting was excruciating, but it accomplished its purpose. The arrow shaft suddenly came free, and Nailnish was able to withdraw it completely in one smooth motion. The obsidian point gleamed wetly in the firelight, its barbed edges stained with blood but intact. McKenna gasped as the arrow was finally removed, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. The immediate pain was actually less than it had been with the arrow in place, though he knew that infection and blood loss remained serious threats to his survival. Nailnish held up the arrow for McKenna to see, a gesture of respect between warriors. "You are brave man," he said simply. "Arrow is out. Now we must clean wound, stop bleeding, make you heal." The next phase of the surgery involved flushing the wound with antiseptic solutions made from various plants and minerals. Nailnish used a hollow bird bone as a syringe, forcing the cleaning fluids deep into McKenna's chest cavity to remove any debris or foreign matter that might cause infection. Each flush brought fresh agony, but McKenna had moved beyond the point where pain mattered. He was fighting for his life now, drawing on reserves of strength he did not know he possessed. The Apache warrior's confidence and skill gave him hope, and he began to believe that he might actually survive this ordeal. Desba worked alongside her husband with practiced efficiency, handing him tools and medicines as needed, applying pressure to control bleeding, and monitoring McKenna's vital signs. She had seen many wounded warriors brought to this lodge over the years, but she had never seen anyone fight harder to live than this young white soldier. As Nailnish began stitching the wound closed with sinew thread and bone needles, he spoke quietly to McKenna about the healing process that lay ahead. "You must stay here many days," he explained. "Wound must close, must heal clean. You must drink much water, eat little food, rest much. If you try to leave too soon, you die." McKenna understood the implications of what Nailnish was saying. He would be a prisoner in this Apache camp for weeks or even months, depending on how quickly he recovered. His fellow soldiers probably assumed he was dead by now, and no rescue mission would be coming to find him. His survival depended entirely on the continued kindness of people he had been sent to kill or capture. But, as he looked up at the Apache medicine man's weathered face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, McKenna felt something he had never expected: gratitude. This man had risked everything to save the life of an enemy. He had defied his own people's wishes, used precious medical supplies, and spent hours performing surgery that could easily have failed. Whatever happened next, McKenna owed his life to Nailnish's courage and compassion. The surgery was finally complete as the first light of dawn began to filter through the lodge opening. Nailnish sat back on his heels, exhausted but satisfied with his work. The wound was clean, the bleeding had stopped, and McKenna's vital signs were stable. The most dangerous part was over, but the recovery would be long and uncertain. McKenna tried to speak but found his voice reduced to a whisper. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words carrying all the gratitude and amazement he felt. Nailnish smiled for the first time since finding McKenna in the canyon. "You thank spirits," he said. "They the ones decide you live. I just hands of spirits." As McKenna drifted off into his first peaceful sleep in days, Nailnish stepped outside the healing lodge to face the questions and concerns of his people. The surgery had been successful, but the real challenges were just beginning. Keeping an enemy soldier alive in an Apache camp would test every relationship and alliance that Nailnish had built over his lifetime. Old Mongoose was waiting for him by the central fire, along with several other senior warriors. Their expressions were serious but not hostile. They respected what Nailnish had accomplished, even if they disagreed with his decision to attempt it. "The white soldier lives?" Mongoose asked. "He lives," Nailnish confirmed. "The spirits have smiled on our work tonight." "And what happens now?" Shadow stepped forward, his young face reflecting the confusion that many in the camp were feeling. "Do we keep him here forever? Do we turn him loose to tell the army about our location? Do we trade him for safe passage to Mexico?" These were all reasonable questions, and Nailnish realized that he did not have good answers for any of them. He had acted on impulse and spiritual guidance to save McKenna's life, but he had not thought through the long-term consequences of his decision. "I do not know," he admitted honestly. "I know only that the spirits commanded me to save this man's life, and I have done so. What happens next will be revealed in time." Mongoose studied his old friend's face in the firelight. He had known Nailnish for over 20 years, had fought beside him in countless battles, and had never questioned his judgment before. But this situation was unlike anything they had faced together. "You have put us all at great risk," Mongoose said quietly. "If the army finds us because of this soldier, if our children die because you chose to save an enemy, how will you face the spirits then?" It was a sobering question, and Nailnish felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He had followed his heart and his training as a medicine man, but he could not ignore the possibility that his compassion might lead to tragedy for his people. "Then, I will face them with the knowledge that I chose mercy over vengeance," he replied. "I will tell them that I remembered what it means to be human, even in the middle of war." The council meeting continued until sunrise, with various warriors expressing their concerns and opinions about what should be done with McKenna. Some wanted to move the camp immediately, before army patrols could discover their location. Others suggested using the soldier as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the government. A few even proposed finishing what the arrow had started, eliminating the problem by eliminating McKenna. But, as the debate continued, something interesting began to emerge. Despite their concerns about security and their anger toward the army in general, most of the Apache people found themselves impressed by what Nailnish had accomplished. The surgery had been a masterful display of traditional healing arts, and the fact that an enemy had been saved made it even more remarkable. By mid-morning, when the council finally disbanded, a consensus had emerged. McKenna would be allowed to remain in the camp until he recovered, but under heavy guard and with strict limitations on his movements. If he proved to be trustworthy, they would consider their options. If he caused problems or posed a threat, other solutions would be found. For now, the young soldier's life had been saved not just by Nailnish's medical skill, but by the Apache people's fundamental belief in the sacredness of life. It was a belief that would be tested again and again in the days to come. The days that followed McKenna's surgery blurred together in a haze of pain, fever, and strange dreams. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find Nailnish or Desba checking his wound or forcing bitter medicines between his lips. Other times he would open his eyes to see Apache children peering at him with curious faces before being shooed away by their mothers. During his lucid moments, McKenna began to observe the life of the Apache camp with the eyes of a soldier who had been trained to see enemies, but was now witnessing the daily reality of human beings trying to survive in a harsh world. What he saw challenged every assumption he had held about these people. The Apache families lived in a carefully organized community where everyone had specific roles and responsibilities. The men were warriors and hunters, but they were also fathers who played gently with their children and husbands who helped their wives with daily chores. The women were fierce protectors of their families, skilled in crafts and healing, and equal partners in the decisions that governed the camp. Children ran freely through the camp, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls despite the constant danger their people faced. They played games that taught them hunting and fighting skills, but they also learned songs and stories that preserved their culture and history. These were not the savage children described in army reports, but bright, happy kids who reminded McKenna of his own childhood in Pittsburgh. The elderly members of the community were treated with profound respect, consulted on important decisions, and cared for with tenderness. McKenna watched old Mongas, who had initially opposed his presence in the camp, spending hours telling stories to his grandchildren, his weathered hands animated as he described great battles and heroic deeds from the past. Most surprising of all was the spiritual life of the Apache people. McKenna had been taught that Indians were heathens who worshipped false gods and practiced barbaric rituals. But what he observed in the camp was a deep, sophisticated relationship with the natural world that seemed more genuinely religious than anything he had experienced in the churches of his youth. Every morning, Nailnish would step outside the healing lodge and offer prayers to the four directions, thanking the spirits for the new day and asking for guidance in his work. These prayers were not desperate pleas to an angry god, but respectful conversations with forces that the Apache believed were present in every mountain, stream, and living creature. As McKenna grew stronger, he began to participate in these daily rituals in his own way. Unable to stand for the first 2 weeks after his surgery, he would lie in his bed and listen to Nailnish's morning prayers, finding comfort in the rhythmic cadence of the Apache language even though he could not understand the words. One morning, about 3 weeks into his recovery, McKenna surprised everyone by attempting to speak a few words in Apache. He had been listening carefully to conversations around him, picking up simple phrases and trying to understand the structure of the language. "Aye," he said to Desba as she brought him his morning meal, using the Apache word for thank you that he had heard countless times. Desba stopped in surprise, then smiled broadly. It was the first time McKenna had seen her smile, and it transformed her entire face. She responded with a stream of Apache words spoken too quickly for him to follow, but her tone was warm and encouraging. Word of the white soldiers' attempt to learn Apache spread quickly through the camp, generating intense discussion among the people. Some saw it as a sign of respect and good intentions. Others worried that he was trying to learn their language in order to spy on them more effectively when he eventually returned to his people. Nailnish was cautiously optimistic about McKenna's progress, both medical and cultural. The soldier's wound was healing better than expected, with no signs of infection or complications. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding Apache ways rather than simply enduring his captivity. "Why do you try to learn our words?" Nailnish asked one evening as he changed McKenna's bandages. McKenna considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you saved my life," he said slowly. "Because I want to understand who you are, not just what I was told you are." It was an honest answer that revealed a level of self-awareness that impressed the Apache medicine man. This young soldier was beginning to think for himself rather than simply accepting the prejudices he had been taught. As McKenna's strength returned, Nailnish began allowing him to sit up for longer periods and, eventually, to walk short distances around the healing lodge. The soldier's first steps outside were tentative and painful, but he was determined to prove that he was recovering and not a burden on the camp's resources. His appearance outside the lodge created a sensation among the Apache children, who had been forbidden from getting too close to the dangerous white man. But when they saw McKenna struggling to walk, leaning heavily on a wooden staff that Nailnish had carved for him, their natural compassion overcame their fear. A little girl named Ista, who was about 6 years old and curious about everything, approached McKenna cautiously while he rested on a log outside the lodge. She stared at his pale skin and light-colored hair with fascination, having never seen anyone who looked so different from her own people. "Sure, yeah," she said softly, pointing to herself. It meant my son but was used by Apache children to identify themselves to adults. McKenna smiled and pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said, then tried to repeat the Apache word she had used. His pronunciation was terrible, but Ista giggled and clapped her hands at his attempt. This simple interaction opened the door for other children to approach. They were fascinated by McKenna's strange appearance and eager to teach him Apache words in exchange for learning English ones. Soon he found himself surrounded by a group of young teachers who delighted in correcting his pronunciation and laughing at his mistakes. The adults watched these interactions with mixed feelings. Some were charmed by the sight of their children befriending the white soldier, seeing it as evidence of the natural human capacity for friendship across racial lines. Others worried that the children were becoming too attached to someone who would eventually leave the camp and might never return. Chato was among those who remained skeptical of McKenna's presence. The young warrior had lost too many friends and family members to white soldiers to trust any of them easily. But even he had to admit that this particular soldier seemed different from the brutal Indian fighters he had encountered in previous battles. "He could be pretending," Shadow said to Nailnish one evening as they watched McKenna playing a simple game with some of the children. "White men are known for their deception. How do we know he is not learning our ways so he can use them against us later?" It was a fair question, and Nailnish had asked himself the same thing many times over the past month. But his instincts as both a warrior and a medicine man told him that McKenna's transformation was genuine. The soldier's eyes had lost the hardness and suspicion that had been there when he first arrived, replaced by something softer and more open. "A man can pretend many things," Nailnish replied thoughtfully. "But he cannot pretend the way children respond to him. Children know the truth in a person's heart better than any adult." As if to prove his point, youngster ran over to McKenna and took his hand, chattering away in Apache about some exciting discovery she had made near the stream. McKenna listened intently, understanding only a few words but responding with genuine interest and affection. The breakthrough in McKenna's integration into camp life came during his 6th week of recovery. He was finally strong enough to help with simple tasks around the camp, and Desba had begun teaching him to gather medicinal herbs in the surrounding mountains. On this particular morning, they were collecting pine bark for antiseptic preparations when they heard the sound of horses approaching the canyon. Both of them froze, listening carefully to determine whether the riders were Apache scouts returning to camp or army patrols who had somehow discovered their location. Desba grabbed McKenna's arm and pulled him behind a large boulder, motioning for him to remain absolutely silent. Through gaps in the rock, they could see 3 riders moving cautiously along the canyon floor. They were not Apache, their clothing and riding style marked them clearly as white men, probably soldiers or Indian agents. McKenna felt his heart racing as he recognized the uniform of his own unit. These were his fellow cavalrymen, probably part of a patrol searching for Apache camps in the area. For a brief moment, he considered calling out to them, identifying himself and asking for rescue. But, as he watched the soldiers below, something stopped him. These men were not on a rescue mission, they were on a seek and destroy operation. He could see the grim determination in their faces, the way they rode with weapons ready and eyes scanning for targets. If they found the Apache camp, they would attack without hesitation, killing everyone they could find regardless of age or gender. McKenna thought about little Ista and the other children who had befriended him. He thought about Nailnish, who had saved his life at great personal risk. He thought about Desba, who had nursed him through fever and infection with the same care she would have given her own son. When one of the soldiers rode close to their hiding place, stopping his horse just a few yards from where they were concealed, McKenna made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Instead of calling out for help, he pressed himself deeper into the shadows and remained silent. The patrol moved on after several tense minutes, apparently satisfied that this part of the canyon was empty. McKenna and Desba waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before emerging from their hiding place. Desba looked at McKenna with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She had expected him to betray the camp's location to his own people, it would have been the natural thing for any soldier to do. Instead, he had protected the very people who were holding him captive. "Why?" she asked in her limited English. "Why you no call to them?" McKenna struggled to find words that could explain the complex emotions swirling through his mind. How could he tell her that in 6 weeks of living among her people, he had learned more about honor and compassion than in 22 years of his previous life? How could he explain that the idea of soldiers attacking this peaceful camp filled him with horror? "Because they are my enemy now too," he said finally. "Anyone who would hurt your children is my enemy." Desba stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She understood that something fundamental had changed in this white soldier's heart, and she knew that Nailnish had been right to save his life. When they returned to camp that evening, Desba told her husband about the patrol and McKenna's decision to remain hidden. The news spread quickly through the community, generating intense discussion about what it meant and how they should respond. Some of the Apache were convinced that McKenna had finally proven his loyalty to their cause. Others remained suspicious, wondering if this was an elaborate trick designed to make them trust him before he betrayed them. But most were simply amazed that a white soldier had chosen to protect Apache lives over his own freedom. That night, the camp held a council meeting to discuss McKenna's future. For the first time since his arrival, he was invited to participate in the discussion rather than simply being talked about as if he were not present. Old Mongoose spoke first, acknowledging that his initial opposition to keeping McKenna in the camp had been based on reasonable security concerns. But the soldier's behavior over the past 6 weeks, culminating in his refusal to signal the patrol, had demonstrated something that changed the entire situation. "This man has chosen us over his own people," Mongoose said, his voice carrying the weight of his years and experience. "That is not something any warrior does lightly. We must ask ourselves what we owe him in return." Young Chatto, who had been McKenna's most vocal opponent, surprised everyone by speaking in the soldier's defense. "I have watched him with our children," he said. "I have seen how he tries to learn our ways, how he shows respect for our customs. If he wished to harm us, he would not work so hard to understand us." The debate continued for several hours, with various members of the community expressing their opinions about what should be done. Some suggested that McKenna should be adopted into the tribe, made a full member of their community. Others felt that he should be allowed to leave whenever he chose, with their blessing and protection. Finally, Nailnish stood to speak. As the man who had saved McKenna's life and taken responsibility for his presence in the camp, his words carried special weight. "6 weeks ago, I found a dying enemy and chose to save his life because the spirits told me it was the right thing to do," he said. "Tonight, I find that enemy has become a brother who would risk his own freedom to protect our children. This tells me that the spirits see further than any of us can see, and that mercy is always the right choice." He turned to McKenna, switching to English so that the soldier could understand his words clearly. "You are no longer prisoner here," he said. "You are guest, you are friend, you are family. You may stay as long as you wish, or you may leave whenever you choose. But know that you will always have home among the Apache people." McKenna felt tears welling up in his eyes as he realized the magnitude of what Nailnish was offering. These people, who had every reason to hate him, were welcoming him into their family. They were offering him something he had never expected to find in the Arizona desert, a place where he truly belonged. "I choose to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For as long as you will have me, I choose to stay." 3 months had passed since McKenna's formal acceptance into the Apache community, and the transformation in both the man and the camp was remarkable. The pale, frightened soldier who had nearly died from an arrow wound had evolved into someone who moved through the mountains with the quiet confidence of a native, his skin bronzed by constant exposure to the sun and his body hardened by the daily challenges of Apache life. Under Nailnish's patient guidance, McKenna had learned not just the Apache language, but the deeper wisdom that governed their relationship with the natural world. He could read animal tracks like words on a page, predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, and find water in places where others saw only barren rock. More importantly, he had learned to see the desert not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a teacher to be respected. The skills came to him with surprising ease, as if some part of his spirit had always belonged in these wild places. His grandfather had been a hunter and tracker in the Pennsylvania mountains, and McKenna discovered that many of the abilities he had learned as a boy translated perfectly to this very different landscape. But the most profound changes were not physical. McKenna had found something in Apache culture that had been missing from his previous life, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal ambition, a connection to something larger than himself. The Apache people lived every day with an awareness of their place in the web of life, and that awareness had begun to transform how McKenna understood his own existence. Nailnish had become far more than just the man who saved his life. He was teacher, father figure, and spiritual guide all rolled into one. The Apache medicine man had taken McKenna under his wing completely, sharing not just medical knowledge but the deeper mysteries of Apache spirituality and philosophy. "You have 2 choices in this life," Nailnish told him one evening as they sat by the fire outside the healing lodge. "You can live like a stone, hard and unchanging, fighting against everything around you. Or you can live like water, soft but powerful, finding a way around obstacles and always flowing toward where you are meant to be." McKenna understood that his mentor was talking about more than just survival techniques. He was describing a fundamental approach to life that the Apache people had developed over centuries of adaptation to challenging circumstances. It was a philosophy that emphasized flexibility over rigidity, cooperation over domination, and wisdom over mere strength. The young man who had once been Private Thomas McKenna was learning to become someone else entirely, someone who belonged not to any army or government, but to the land itself and the people who had learned to live in harmony with it. The process was not always easy, requiring him to question everything he had been taught about civilization, progress, and what it meant to be successful in life. One crisp morning in early November, as McKenna helped Desba gather the last of the healing herbs before winter set in, they were interrupted by the arrival of a lone Apache scout riding hard toward the camp. The man's face was grim, and he spoke urgently to the first warriors he encountered, pointing back toward the entrance to the canyon. Within minutes, the entire camp was buzzing with activity. Families began gathering their most precious possessions, and warriors checked their weapons while scanning the ridges for signs of approaching enemies. McKenna felt his blood run cold as he realized what was happening. The army had found them. Nailnish appeared at his side, his weathered face tight with concern. "Soldiers coming," he said grimly. "Many soldiers, maybe 50 or 60. They will be here before sunset." McKenna's mind raced as he processed this information. A force that size was not a patrol, it was a full military expedition designed to destroy the camp and capture or kill everyone in it. The Apache had perhaps 4 hours to evacuate before the soldiers arrived, and some of the elderly and injured members of the community would have difficulty making the journey to safety. "What can I do to help?" McKenna asked immediately. Nailnish studied his face carefully, as if searching for any sign of divided loyalty. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "You help families pack, help move children and old people to safety." "But, Thomas," he paused, using the English name that he rarely employed anymore. "If soldiers catch you here, they think you traitor. They maybe shoot you same as us." It was a sobering reminder of McKenna's precarious position. In the eyes of the United States Army, he was officially dead, killed in action during the fight at Skeleton Canyon. If he was discovered alive and living with the Apache, he would be considered a deserter at best and a traitor at worst. Either designation could result in execution. But McKenna did not hesitate. "These are my people now," he said firmly. "I will help them get to safety, no matter what happens to me." The next few hours were a whirlwind of desperate activity. The Apache people, who had faced this situation many times before, moved with practiced efficiency to dismantle their camp and prepare for emergency evacuation. Everything that could not be carried was either hidden or destroyed to prevent it from falling into army hands. McKenna threw himself into the work with desperate energy, helping to pack essential supplies and assisting elderly tribal members who would need extra support during the difficult journey ahead. Little Ista, who had become especially attached to him over the past months, clung to his hand as her family prepared to leave their home. "Where we go?" she asked in the mixture of Apache and English that had become their private language. "To safe place," McKenna assured her, trying to project confidence he did not feel. "Your people know many safe places in the mountains." As the sun reached its zenith, the evacuation was nearly complete. Families began moving out of the canyon in small groups, following different routes to confuse any trackers who might try to follow. The warriors would remain behind to set up defensive positions and delay the army advance as long as possible. Old Mongas approached McKenna as the last of the civilian families prepared to leave. "You go with families," he ordered. "You are not warrior of our people. You do not stay and fight." But McKenna shook his head. "With respect, grandfather, I disagree. I may not have been born Apache, but I have chosen to be Apache. If the warriors stay and fight, then I stay and fight too." It was a declaration that carried profound implications. By choosing to remain and fight alongside the Apache warriors, McKenna was making his transformation complete. He was no longer a white man living among Indians, he was an Apache warrior defending his people against outside aggression. Mongas studied McKenna's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "If you stay, you fight as Apache. You take Apache name, you follow Apache ways, you maybe die as Apache. The naming ceremony was brief but deeply meaningful. As the other warriors gathered around, Nailnish placed his hand on McKenna's shoulder and spoke the words that would complete his transformation. "From this day forward, you are no longer Thomas McKenna," he announced. "You are Bazoshi, the one who stands with us. This is your true name, the name your spirit has always carried." Bazoshi McKenna felt the Apache name settle into his soul like a key finding its lock. It was who he had always been meant to be, he realized. All his years as Thomas McKenna had been preparation for this moment, for this choice to stand with people who valued honor and courage above conquest and gold. The warriors took their positions among the rocks overlooking the main approach to the canyon. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, but they had the advantages of superior knowledge of the terrain and the desperate motivation that came from defending their homes and families. As the afternoon wore on, dust clouds began to appear on the horizon, growing larger and more distinct as the army column approached. Through field glasses taken from previous battles, the Apache scouts could see the blue uniforms and guidons that marked this as a major military operation. At the head of the column rode Captain Morrison, the same officer who had led McKenna's original patrol months earlier. McKenna recognized him even at a distance, and he felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve as he realized that he would soon be fighting against men who had once been his brothers in arms. But there was no hesitation in his heart. The Apache people had shown him what true brotherhood meant, not the artificial bonds created by shared uniform and flag, but the deep connections forged by mutual respect, genuine caring, and willingness to sacrifice for others. The soldiers approaching the canyon were following orders and serving their country, but they were also participating in the destruction of a culture that was older and, in many ways, wiser than their own. The first shots were fired just as the sun began to set behind the western peaks. The Army Scouts had spotted the Apache positions and were attempting to probe for weaknesses in their defenses. Rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls, and the acrid smell of gunpowder began to drift on the evening air. McKenna, now Bazoshi, lay behind a carefully constructed rock fortification, his Springfield rifle loaded and ready. When the first line of soldiers came within range, he took careful aim and fired. The shot was true, dropping a cavalry trooper from his horse and causing the rest of the line to seek cover. For a moment, the reality of what he was doing hit him like a physical blow. He was shooting at United States soldiers, men who might have been his friends and comrades in another life. But then, he thought about little Ista and her family, probably still making their way through the treacherous mountain paths to safety, and his resolve hardened again. The battle continued through the night, with the soldiers repeatedly attempting to storm the Apache positions and being driven back each time with heavy casualties. The warriors fought with the desperation of men defending everything they held dear, and their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them significant advantages despite being heavily outnumbered. But, as dawn began to break, it became clear that the Apache position was becoming untenable. The soldiers had managed to work around to the sides of the canyon during the night, threatening to surround the defenders completely. Ammunition was running low, and several warriors had been wounded in the fierce fighting. Nailnish made the decision to withdraw while they still could, following escape routes that had been prepared years earlier for just such an emergency. One by one, the warriors began slipping away from their positions, moving through hidden passages that would allow them to reunite with their families in the mountains. Bazoshi was among the last to leave his position, covering the retreat of wounded warriors who needed assistance to escape. As he helped young Chato, who had taken a bullet in the leg, navigate a narrow ledge that led to safety, he looked back one last time at the canyon that had been his home for the past 4 months. The army would find the camp abandoned when they finally worked up the courage to advance, but they would also find evidence that this had been a thriving community rather than a military base. There would be children's toys scattered in the dust, cooking fires still warm with the meals that had been abandoned, and the kind of domestic details that would make some of the soldiers question what they were really fighting for. 3 days later, the survivors of the attack had regrouped at a secret location high in the mountains, a place known only to the Apache and accessible only by treacherous trails that would challenge even experienced mountain climbers. The families had made it to safety, but the cost had been heavy. 3 warriors had been killed in the fighting, and several others were nursing serious wounds. As the Apache people began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives once again, Bazoshi found himself playing an increasingly important role in their community. His knowledge of army tactics and procedures made him valuable as a strategic advisor, while his growing understanding of Apache medicine and healing arts allowed him to assist Nailnish in treating the wounded. But, perhaps most importantly, he had become a bridge between two worlds, helping his new people understand the motivations and methods of their enemies while never losing sight of which side he had chosen to support. He was living proof that transformation was possible, that people could change their fundamental allegiances when they encountered something greater than their previous understanding. One evening, as winter began to settle over the high mountains and snow started to dust the peaks around them, Bazoshi sat with Nailnish by a small fire, discussing plans for the difficult months ahead. The Apache people would need to survive a harsh winter with limited supplies, all while avoiding army patrols that would be searching for them throughout the territory. "Do you ever regret it?" Nailnish asked quietly. "Do you ever wish you had called out to those soldiers that day, gone back to your old life?" Bazoshi considered the question carefully, thinking about the comfortable life he had abandoned in Pennsylvania, the steady pay and security of army service, the approval of a society that would have celebrated him as a hero if he had died fighting Indians instead of living among them. "No," he said finally. "I was dead when you found me in that canyon, grandfather. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You did not just save my life, you gave me a life worth living." Nailnish smiled in the firelight, his weathered face creasing with satisfaction. "The spirits knew what they were doing when they guided my hands that day. They knew that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemy, but from turning him into family." As the first snows of winter began to fall, Bazoshi pulled his Apache blanket closer around his shoulders and felt a deep sense of peace settle into his bones. He had found his true home at last, not in any particular place but in a way of being that honored all life and recognized the sacred connections that bound all people together. The man who had once been Private Thomas McKenna was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that real strength came from compassion, real courage came from choosing mercy over vengeance, and real victory came from building bridges instead of walls. In the years that followed, Bazoshi would become a legendary figure among both the Apache people and the army units that pursued them. To the Apache, he was the white warrior who had chosen their way of life over his own, proof that understanding and friendship were possible even across